Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session called Identifying Methods of Financing for a World at Peace. This is a bit of a provocation, isn't it? Because we live in a world that is anything but at peace. So our speakers are going to tell you how the geopolitical context of today, which is a complicated context, is impacting their institutions, and they're going to go back to the solutions. Do we need to be more creative to fund projects? Because we live in a world that is more complex than before. Let me introduce your panelist, Jacob von Weizsäcker, who's Minister of Finance and Science of Saar in Germany. We have Odile Renaud Bassot, President of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian, who's the head of the French office of the EIB. And we have Paulo Correa, who's Executive Director for Brazil and Suriname of the BID, the Inter-American Development Bank. Pierre Jacquet, who's a member of the Cercle des Économistes, and he will introduce the session and let us understand what is at stake here today. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, we don't live in a world at peace, so if you really want to be provocative, to prepare for peace, let's prepare the war and finance our defense, basically. So we see that there's a very strong pressure on us to increase on our defense capacities. That was, I was being a bit controversial here, but building a world of peace takes much more than that. What is the role of international financing to go back to world at peace? A fundamental question is what is the raison d'être of international financing? Why countries, no matter what they are, have an interest in freeing up some resources to fund some international goals that could be development, solidarity, but also common goods like climate or other public goods that are emerging for some of them. So we changed our regime, the multilateral framework in which we're living, which was a world where the states had put in place a strategy of cooperation to obtain common goals. And this, unfortunately, is the world that is no longer universal, because some big powers have decided that the pursuit of common goals was going in the opposite direction than their own personal interests, and that jeopardizes the whole structure of governance of globalization. You can name those powers, can't you, Pierre? I can name them, of course. There's the United States first, but we can see that the shift is visible in numbers. The public aid for development has dropped for the first time ever, minus 25% in real numbers, after a drop already in 2024 of 6%. And this is going to continue. So this drop in the United States, well, the United States accounts for 75% of this debt. So that means the other countries, France, UK, Germany, Japan, have to compensate for it. And the flows of solidarity have narrowed down. If we compare the volumes funded that keep being provided mostly by the traditional donor countries, this disruption gives an even more important role to other actors such as China, which is now the first debtor in the world for many years now, and some other powers that we could call middle powers. We're not going to go back to the world as it used to be. One of the questions that this panel can tackle is what strategy should we adopt in those conditions. If we live in a world of multilateralism, there's many things that were beautiful that were created in the past. How do we preserve them? How do we preserve what has been done? Is it the only possible approach, or is the strategy about creating a new world by forging new alliances and identifying new goals? And in a context where the budgets are narrowing down, it's a very important question to solve. So let's not dream here. I think an important question is, why should we fund international goals? For solidarity reasons. And contrary to what we may believe, when we conduct opinion surveys, there's a majority of the population that continues to believe and be favorable to supporting international solidarity. But in a context of budgetary constraints, it's difficult because we'll need to preserve our resources. So we need to reestablish the link between international funding and politics. Politics not to defend just the companies of our own country, but to think about the construction of new alliances. If we finance something, it has, of course, a geopolitical impact. It builds networks of friendships that allow us to go beyond the funding and let us do things together. We need to construct new coalitions together. Beyond all of that, the major problem in our world remains the same, is that we have an economic interdependence that is a reality, even if the politics of the bigger powers is aiming at getting it back for themselves. But this economic interdependence should force us to think about allocating resources internationally, but how to manage crisis and how to redistribute the resources. And we're very far from that. But we can keep trying to build this utopia, particularly in the current situation. But I think the question has become very political. How can we build new networks of alliances, particularly without the United States at the moment, but let's not give up on doing it again, or building, in the meantime, coalitions with other countries, middle-sized countries. This is the idea of the Canadian Prime Minister. But understanding first that funding goes way beyond just the simple financing objectives. Funding is a political act. Thank you, Pierre. We're going to start with the political man of this panel, Jacob von Weizsäcker. You're Minister of Finance and Science of Saarland in Germany. I'd like to introduce you a bit because you come from the SPD party and you start one of the most striking reforms of the decade in Germany, because it was about reforming this block to indebting by creating a special fund of 500 billion euros over 12 years, financed by debt, by borrowing, which is François de Gallo calls the historic turning point for Germany and for Europe. So you thought there was a major turn of 180-degree turn in Germany. How do you perceive this geopolitical context, and what impact does it have in the choices of financing, particularly to finance common good? I will start by saying I would like to remind you to really appreciate the global institutions that we have at hand, the World Bank and the IMF. For now, we cannot recreate them, so there are some issues and there's some situations where the US can block some decisions. However, for a number of common goods, global common goods, it's extremely important to have them. So even if it is not just a matter of funding, the fact that today there's no universal protectionism, it's thanks to the WTO, sorry. Even if there's a crisis in our global world, we are lucky that there's a few institutions that are remaining that can still take decisions. It's becoming more and more difficult, but let's not forget the fact that we have them, and we need to keep investing in those institutions, keeping in mind that they cannot give everything that you would want them to give. And second point, in this global disorder, if I could call it that way, we need to create some clubs between countries, and Europe can play a key role in this role to create clubs of countries to, even if it's not about global common goods, but it could be common goods belonging to the club, or that could have can become global. For example, if today, I give you a concrete example, if the WHO is going through a crisis at the moment because the United States left this organization, we can imagine that some other countries can create their own clubs to produce vaccines. And all the countries that are a member of that particular club could have access to those vaccines. It doesn't mean that you have to be rich to be in the club. It could also include a few developing countries in these clubs. So the club logic seems important to me. Third point, there's some domains where there's a real urgency to act. And this is a reason why I was in favor of an easing of the budget rules in budgetary policy in Germany in terms of digital technologies, media, and safety. There's a real urgency to act. And we really have to be pragmatic. We need to do what works. Of course, we need to think, but not overthink it either. We need to create institutions, but not too complex ones. Let's not waste too much time to manage to do that. We need to use a form of variable geometry. Thank you very much. Odile Renaud-Bassot, you're chairing the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD. You're the first woman to chair this institution. You've been also the first chair of the Treasury in France. You worked among the European Commission for many years. The EBRD is an institution that is multilateral, but we know that it was created at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, so it represents some values to try to push these countries to adopt a market economy. There's some democratic values within the EBRD. How do these values and your functioning is impacted by this new geopolitical context, which is a world of bilateralism and the rule of force? For the EBRD, considering the history of bank, which was created when the Berlin Wall fell down, the opening to the fall of communist countries and these countries opening up to market economy, the EBRD wanted to support them in this transition. And we have a real shock now because we have two major shareholders, which Russia and Ukraine. They were playing a very important role in our institution, and it was upended by the war, the attack of Russia. So we're kind of impacted by this shock. But what matters today is how, beyond this complete change of environment, how do we adjust? And how do institutions, as the EBRD, manage to adjust in this new environment? In 2014, when Russia started to attack Crimea and annex Crimea, we stopped. We were the major investor in Russia. We invested millions of dollars and of euros per year in Russia. We stopped it altogether. And in 2022, with the war of Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, we went to another step, and we continue to invest in a country at war, which is for a development bank is not an obvious thing to do. The first idea is to worry about, we invest in a country that we don't know if it's going to be standing on its 2 feet tomorrow. So we managed to find the right support with the help of the shareholders to keep investing in a country at war and to help them reconstruct infrastructures that were bombed, help companies to continue developing their business in a world at war, which really shows that we can be very agile. There's a country with an IMF program is the premier. In a way, it shows that the adaptability of the institutions with ways of governance that allow us to keep making decisions because we have rules of majority. We don't need to reach a consensus between all countries to be able to act. And this is a great strength for us. Americans, for example, are the first shareholders of the BRD with more than 10% of shares. But we have a lot of European countries as well as shareholders, among themselves, plus the EBI. They are also shareholders, and we have a very controversial question with the US is climate questions. But the majority of the shareholders backing this goal have continued to give it priority to this action, even the opposition of one shareholder. It doesn't mean that the Americans are out of the BRD. They're still shareholders. They continue to participate in the debate. It's not all black or all white. We have a priority for the bank, which is the improvement of the governance in the countries where we operate. So the governance of public sector, the state of law, fighting against corruption. This is part of your values, isn't it? Yes. Transparent management of companies. How can we ensure a good management of public money? This priority has always been ours, but we insist more and more on it, and the Americans are supporting us on that. So this is the variable geometry map that Jacob was mentioning. It's an institution that is going to reach, some domains reach consensus, some domains there are going to be countries voting against, but it still works because we can deliver by delivering support to the countries where we operate and by taking part in trying to provide global common goods. Sorry. What about your support to Ukraine? Was it a political decision on the EBRD side to continue investing in a country at war and to get out of Russia?
Yes, that was a decision which we took with our shareholders. It was a political decision. So Ukraine needed support, economic support. We are not at all involved in the military side of things. Our shareholders are not supporting any financing of military actions, but we support businesses, infrastructures, which are so important for the country to keep operating. So that was a decision which was very political, which we took with our board of directors and our shareholders. Would you like to come back to what's just been said? Yeah. In France, we've been talking a lot about how public debt for development should evolve in the future. I think what Pierre Jacquet said about the importance of solidarity and also the global interests of our country, these are areas where we have to continue to invest because we have economic interests, but also because the stability of neighboring countries, Mediterranean countries and sub-Saharan countries, their stability is so fundamental for European stability. So our approach is often focusing on the interests of businesses and the economy, but often it's important to underline the importance of stability and the development of countries around us for the prosperity of our own country and for Europe in general. Grégoire Chauvrier-Le Drian, you are the head of the EIB. The EIB is the financial arm of the European Union with 27 shareholding countries. Airbus, for example, is going to receive $3 billion loan from the EIB. We learned that in the newspapers 3 days ago. This is a record amount. So in this political and geopolitical impact, how does it impact the EIB's choices? Well, financial institutes have different mandates. The EBRD and the EIB have different mandates, although they do overlap in some areas. I think we are convinced that our investments made by these institutions, enable to ward off crises, to reduce breaches and to prepare the future. And I think that's one of the roles of the European Bank. We have 27 member states. We have a mandate to invest in the European key strategies inside Europe and outside Europe, beyond its borders. And in a world which is constantly changing, the member states, our shareholders, want the institution to do more and more of this, to act given all of these crises that are cropping up increasingly. And so the institution has increased its investments so that we don't step in for, but we can accompany investments by member states. So the 27 have to make a budget. That's quite unique. So what you do, and it's quite interesting to say, is nothing to do with the individual budgets of each country. A lot of the budgets are in the red. Yeah, obviously there are some budgetary difficulties around, and often one associates European funding with subsidies, with aid. But the EIB's model is completely different. We are a bank. There is no budgetary transfer from the countries to us. We have bonds. We have the best score, AAA score. So it just shows that Europe is better. 3 A's is better than the score of most of our member states. So we have the best possible score. So 27 together is stronger than each state on its own. So we put bonds out on the market and we finance them as cheaply as possible at competitive rates. Because we're a public institution such as the EBRD, we're not aiming for profit. What we want is for the projects which we invest in, the different sectors we choose to invest in, can get finance at competitive rates and over a long period of time, because a long-term investment is what is going to guarantee lasting peace, if we can hope for that one day, because these investments are in health, infrastructures, education, interconnection. These are investments which are preparing the future and will guarantee, we hope, the convergence of our different economies, cohesion between different countries, which are factors of peace and stability. Paulo Correa, you work for the Inter-American Development Bank. For a long time, you were an economist with the World Bank. So Brazil and Latin America are very interesting to you today. Your institution is multilateral. Your Inter-American Development Bank has a main shareholder who is the United States. We learned yesterday that the World Bank is abandoning the target of 45% of funding in the green economy under pressure of the Trump administration. So what's the impact on you?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I have learned a lot in the last 2 days. It's really a pleasure to be here. So to go straight to your question, the first outcome is that I think it's very likely that we will have to consider how to do. We do have targets for climate financing. We are committed to finance 47 to 50%. 47 to 50% of all the financing that we do. EIB, EBRD also have targets, but I think we're going to have to change those very quickly. Now, the good news is that the good news is that this is not. It does not imply that climate financing will necessarily decline for developing countries. As far as the risk country ownerships, in other words, that the countries go to those banks and to the IDB and request funding for projects related to resilience, to mitigation, and any other areas, there is a commitment that these resources will be available. So the narrative, it doesn't look good. In fact, the commitments are important because to a large extent, climate financing in the past years has been dependent on the MDB's financing. This is a commitment at the Paris Agreement of all MDBs. So it is important, but not having them does not imply that the climate financing will decrease. I wanted to make one more comment related to a developing country perspective and the issue of clubs. And we do need development finance, which is finance beyond climate finance. We need other sustainable development goals, and for that we need finance. So, and resources are drying up. As you know, just for climate, we need 1.3 trillion. In Baku, we've only managed to commit to 300 billion. A lot of this money comes from OECD countries, ODA, and this is declining, as we heard in the beginning. Brazil tried to push ahead in the G20 and in COP30 with two ideas of compulsory financing from either taxes, like maritime taxes that would finance climate finance, or wealth taxes that would finance the fight against extreme poverty and hunger. Politically, these things didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. Now, the point is that the geometry, the foundations of the current global architecture for development finance is in disarray. It's based on voluntary contributions. For different reasons, it is declining. Coordination and multilateralism, which is not fashionable for many governments right now. And finally, rule of law. So since we don't have all that, so we need really the idea of clubs, etc. But I wanted to highlight one point. I'd like to come back later, which is also we need to prioritize better. There is too much fragmentation. There is too many objectives, different ways to apply for these resources internationally. We need better target, better focus to be able to scale up. And I will, if I have time, I will argue later on that one of these objectives should be the elimination of extreme poverty. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur le ministre, alors juste...
Mr. Minister, your answer to that. In this second part, we would like to know what kind of tools are being put forward in this rather complicated world. We've understood how it works. We understand that you are unorthodox. You, the Germans, do you have any unorthodox tools to offer to the rest of us? I'm going to start by noting that there are new global public goods. And I'm going to stress the question of digital technologies and AI, but also the media. I think we are underestimating the extent to which they influence not only the way our democracies function in Europe, throughout Europe, but also it has a huge impact on our capacity as a global community to cooperate. It really is important. There is an intellectual job of work to be done. Institutions have to roll up their sleeves. We need regulations as well. And we also need to work with the private sector to come up with some better solutions. And one way of looking at this is to say that we have a digital economy that is which is taking up all of our attention. Like us here on the panel, I hope we're attracting all of your attention. The commercial stakes are high. And so if you've got a mindset that's focusing on knowledge, on enlightenment, if you like, that is the digital economy, which doesn't necessarily have the same commercial advantages as other models, more democratic, more open models. Possibly democratic. But the question is, as individuals and as a society, are we taking our decisions based on knowledge? Or are we taking our decisions based on reflex? Let me give you an example here. When internet was first invented, there was that idea that internet was going to link all of our brains together and make a huge, very powerful brain that would arrive at the best decisions. But today, we get the feeling that that is the case in some ways, but we're linking very old parts of the brain, no new parts of the brain. And so there is a lot of reflex a lot of reflex actions. It's really interesting in Taiwan, where the Minister of Digital Technologies suggested a model based on digital technologies of interactions between different citizens to come up with the best solutions to the problems of society. So there was an algorithm which tried to hone in on common elements between the different citizens, not the elements that divided them. And it worked quite well. So I think looking for funding and regulation to make sure that AI goes in that direction. But when we're talking about global public goods, we think about the climate, health, biodiversity, poverty. We don't necessarily think about that other thing, about new digital technologies. And just to wrap up, the same applies to security. That's a new challenge. It's hardly a surprise to me to know that Luxembourg's Prime Minister, which is right next to Saarland, where I live, that a Canadian Prime Minister said we should create a new institution to finance common defence investments. This is almost a conversation between the French and the German. And let's recognise this. For the time being, even between France and Germany, we are not mobilising the necessary synergy to take us forward on what would be a fabulous project. Perhaps Odile Françoise Renaud-Bassot would like to react. So, this suggestion of a smaller institution between Europe, Canada and other countries to extend funding. So common good could be artificial intelligence, defence, why not? There's more money being channeled into defence than the climate right now, so there is some arbitration which needs to take place. To come back on digital technologies, because BRD is already investing in that field, are we not lagging too far behind? Well, the new stakes, digital technologies, defence, etc., but the new world we're living in and the new challenges we're facing mean that we have to take a fresh look at how we're investing. Cybersecurity, for example. When you're doing any infrastructure project, you immediately have to address the question of cybersecurity. When you're working in the field of energy or renewables, you have to find out whether the supplier has what kind of control do you have over the data, how stable is the system. These were questions which were just not in our mindset. But now we have to include that in the advice that we can give to countries. Say, be careful in such and such or to businesses as well. We have to advise them on how they can protect themselves in terms of cybersecurity. For a country, how they can manage this question of dependency. We saw that with COVID and the consequences of the wars in the Ukraine and the Middle East, these questions of dependency and having production infrastructures which depend too heavily on other countries. So economic development strategies, or if I may butt in, with the Iran war, we realize how very dependent Europe is. Yeah, it takes time. Europe has developed some alternative production infrastructures, but yes, it's a heavily fragmented and very conflictual world today. and there are a lot of risks. So we really have to reflect on this and build this into development strategies, including questions of local production, so that we can enhance the value chain and be less dependent. We can produce added value locally. The second chapter, which is also very important, if you want to talk about the absence of subsidies, is that you have to work with the private sector. So our mandate is to work mainly with private investors, not to fund states or the public sector, but to work with private projects and help them. And that is one way of funding development through private investment. One of the big challenges for development banks today, as Grégoire said, is that we have our balance sheet, we levy funds, we can take out loans, we've got strong financial foundations, but we are not on a level with the financing needs to cope with the climate change or the development of developing countries. So we have to combine private investments with our own investments. We work, for example, with fund managers and pension funds here in Europe, in the Netherlands, for example. We have these funds which are interested in allocating some of their investments to projects in emerging countries, because there will be impact there that will contribute socially, or there will be an impact on the climate, which satisfies the needs of the retired, for example, who want to have that impact. They are not going to take big risks. It's a small part of their investments, but it can really make a difference. So we work very much to try and develop mechanisms with private actors, with insurance companies as well, which are trying to enhance their yield. And they too can work with us to fund, to have a lever effect of our own investments, to attract private investors. And I believe that this is a path which we will take increasingly in the future to fund these countries.
So private companies, you mean, right? Grégoire, Chevrière-Le Drian, we need to be more creative. Is that what this is about? We feel like the arm of strength is going to be the European Union. There are differences between France and Germany and all that. It's not that simple, and Spain as well. How do we ramp it up? How do we scale up on AI? It's interesting to notice that a number of European financing turn to the US, the NASDAQ. So there's a whole part of the European savings that are being invested in the US. And this money is leaving the continent for the US. How do we face this type of reaction to the geopolitical context? Well, my comment, and I want to react to what Odile was explaining, the Draghi report that 800 billion of financing needs per year. The European Bank for Reconstruction is the European Investment Bank as well. So the money cannot all be found in the public powers, so we have to turn to strategic investment partners. Our role as public institution is to advance things, to work as a catalytic power. We try to gather the banks, investment funds, to have a synergy that is led by the public policy, but we also embark the private sector, even if we're going to take the first part of the risk to kind of de-risk an investment that is going to be made. These strategic choices and these strategic projects can be topics that are very structuring for Europe. I have in mind, electric batteries, for example. When Europe decides to get out of the thermal engine by 2030 and to just break away from have to import some oil, the idea is not to be dependent on another commodity, is to promote the emergence of actors who are going to offer a real European option on the European ground of electric batteries, for example. It needs time, of course, to build the industry, and it's risky. So Northvolt, that we supported from the beginning, it's not a success story. Second example, Vercors in France, the demonstrator in Grenoble with the financing in 2020, and another project in Dunkirk that we supported on huge amounts. We're talking about 200 billion euros. So our role with other actors, particularly private actors, is to try to regroup this savings that you mentioned, that is invested massively on the American market rather than in Europe, and to create favorable conditions to mobilize those funds. We do it on an everyday basis on the projects that we finance. We do it with some tools that are innovative. This is innovative finance, like a European Champion Initiative. With that initiative, we're trying to promote the emergence of investment funds that have a goal to reach over €1 billion. So we can invest 200, 300 million euros as a partner to make sure that this fund can invest in, rounds of tables of several million euros. Before we didn't have enough of a market in Europe, and those companies were finding funders in other markets. So our role is to find those funds with a political orientation, with a political governance, and to earmark them to the priorities of Europe, which is first fighting against climate change. That we're going to keep that, and of course, over 60% of our activity, and France is the first to benefit from it, from the segment. Second is innovation that we invest on. There won't be any peace if we don't promote jobs, and there's another sector that you mentioned, which came on top of the other ones in terms of priority, is defense and security. This was a segment that we didn't take into account, like alcohol or pornography, by some investors. Today, now, Europe is no longer naive, so we multiply by 4 our investments in defense sector, and that operation, like we did with Airbus for 3 billion euros, Thales last year, and smaller companies. We don't do it on our own. We do it together with banks, because they borrow money from us to loan even 3 or 4 times more, because the EIB is quite fragmented and through funds, some companies or equity funds, they can have access to European funding with some good resources. Paulo Correa, what are the tools that you use, the Inter-American Development Bank, to finance? You mentioned poverty. That remains a very important topic that requires a lot of funds, but maybe with a special method, more innovative methods and tools. What do you have to say about that?
Thank you very much. I think this is essentially one of the important messages. There are a lot of priorities right now here for Europe. And I wanted to bring this one from the perspective of the Global South, if you want. And there is a recent study from Berkeley University saying that to eliminate extreme poverty in the world requires 0.3% of the global GDP. So it's affordable, number one. Number two, I want you to think for a moment what it means to live without $2.15 a day. I don't know how much is gum or a glass of water. It's $2.15 a day. I had the chance to work not only in Brazil, of course, but in Mozambique, Madagascar, some very poor countries in Africa. And this is the difference from eating or not eating 1 meal a day or less, eating from trash. I don't want to be dramatic, but I do want to appeal to your sense of priorities among several other very important that exist here, I'm sure, and I do relate to those. Now, why we think this is possible? It's not only financially viable. I think we know what to do, we know how to do, and why to do. And one of the main examples are the conditional cash transfers, or the cash transfers that exist in part of the world, including in Brazil. The program is called Bolsa Família. It gives resources to extreme poor families, conditioned to keeping kids at school, keeping kids vaccinated, And currently, it attains 20.8 million people. It's affordable. It has resulted in people living out of extreme poverty, better attendance rates at school, lower mortality rates, intergenerational mobility, which is very important. We've been hearing here past days the importance of having hope in the future. Imagine what is this about in Latin America and all the impact on populism and all these things that we don't like necessarily. And finally, the impact on crime. And this is all documented by rigorous academic studies. And now why financial external aid is so important? Because it happens that in countries that are most in need, like Madagascar and Mozambique, there are just too many extreme poor for too little GDP. So in other words, the program doesn't fit in the budget, doesn't fit in the overall economy of those countries. So that implies that we will need for a while some external financing for such types of programs, number one. And number two, you're going to need technical assistance to help shape these programs to the reality of those countries, fitting it in the technicalities. One final example, 30% of people in Mozambique don't have IDs, so they legally don't exist. So you cannot start any social program like that. So it will take time, it will require technical assistance. IDB only works for Latin America and the Caribbean, but we were planning to have such a type of intervention in Haiti, which is more or less our equivalent. So again, I know this is a little bit orthogonal with other issues that we have been addressing here, but from a development perspective and from a perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean, I wanted to bring this into the table.
Et cette aide locale conditionnelle a fonctionné au Brésil.
And this conditional help functioned in Brazil, didn't it?
Est-ce que vous voulez peut-être...
Pierre Jacquet, do you want to briefly conclude, wrap up so we can leave 5 minutes to take the questions from the room? Yes, thank you. I would like to note a number of things. First of all, paradox, which is that we mentioned this geopolitical dynamic that leads to a fragmented world, and at the same time there's a need for collective action that was never so urgent with changing the public goods, the common public goods. So this encompasses climate, security, fight against international crime, health as well, with the pandemics that came out as a collective common good and not only national common good, information that is international as well, management, new challenges and opportunities led by AI, raised by AI. So we have this tension that is rather good news because it means, so you're optimistic, yes, because this geopolitical dynamic that is breaking up is not compatible with this need for common action. So it means that we're going to be forced to find a solution. And this solution is going to be to build some coalitions around common goals. The clubs that Jakob was mentioning, and I think that's fundamental. The second idea is to mobilize the private sector and to make a link with the previous theme. It shouldn't be clubs of states. It should be clubs of actors, private and public, gathered around common goals. The problem was mobilizing the public sector is the numbers, isn't it? It's like trillions, billions, and well, the private sector has its own logic, and it's only going to invest in a project if it's profitable. So we have to build coalitions around particular goals. How can we fight against climate change? How can we reduce poverty? How can we, by associating the private sector from the beginning, from the design phase? And if we do it that way, we can do a lot of things, and I think it's a fundamental approach. The third message is the balance between rupture and continuity. We feel that we're in a world of disruption, but yet we've built these institutions that play a major role. So what we've heard around this table is the fact that we have institutions that are in charge with instruments that have proven to work, and now we need to put political will behind that to gather all this strengths. And what we're lacking in this club philosophy is the capacity to work together. And the problem of having institutions is create a form of institutional logic, and it creates competition among those institutions. So how can we go beyond that and create common actions around common goals? Let's ask the room if they have questions. Any questions in the room? Yes, gentlemen. Maybe somebody's going to bring you a mic. Thank you. I have a question for investments of the European Bank on the funding defense. My first question is, are those investments from the European Bank, are they taken into account when we calculate the GDP? So the countries, the percentage of the GDP that the countries allocate to their defense, and is it the same breakdown among each countries, or some countries are privileged, like, for example, the Baltic states? Who was to answer? Grégoire. We don't give the priority to any country. There's a request that it's not the same, and the industrial basis is not the same either. It's different throughout Europe. We need to answer the request and the markets without giving and spoiling any secrets. The two countries that benefit the most for the European Bank are Poland and France, with a very dynamic private market. In terms of counting, based on the GDP, we think, however, on how to calculate it within the commitment of the country to NATO. The mechanism is a bit more complex in the tools that I mentioned early on mobilizing the private sector. We like to think about creating a fund, a defense equity facility, in which we try to attract the public and private sector. And the share that would be paid by the public sector would be counted within that commitment from the GDP. Another question? And the commitment to NATO, sorry. Gentlemen out there, I have a question on defense. There's a NATO investment fund to invest on startups that create defense equipment. Maybe you can do something like this, like for the climate or other goals that you've defined and identified. Grégoire, again, we try to invest. We're aware that we need to invest in defense and tech at the same time. We want to reconcile innovation and defense. When we talk about technology, we don't always talk about mature companies. We're looking at early stage. We have funds who do it with venture investment. But there's also a fund from the European Commission that enlarged its investment scope to defense. It's called EIC, European Independent Council, who has two tools, one up to 4 million euros of subsidies and one in private equity that can go up to 30 million euro. It was enlarged recently by what we call the STEP program. I'm sorry for all these acronyms. And they can give up to 30 million, and that number could be even increased to 50 or 70 million euros, which is a game changer versus the European Commission, which hadn't made any investment in equity recently at all. And we see this ambition to be there for early stage companies and defense. Last question, Mr. Minister, you want the floor? It's a very important question, and Europe can play a major role there, but we need to really have a common reflection among the member states. I'm talking about my own country. We're increasing the defense budget and the spending by 50 to 150 billion per year. And at the moment in the US, they spend 10 or 12% of the military spending on technology. In Germany, it's rather 2%. In France, I don't know the number. But if you look around European countries, there's a very direct link between the traditional suppliers of weapons and the government. So technology is not enough invested in. So if the member states don't start to think about it, could they ramp up on their percentage towards 10% in technology? Europe by itself is not going to manage to change that mindset, which is important for security and to avoid a waste of resources that is not going to help our economy. So it's very important, the point that you're making. Europe can make things happen. But without the member states' political will, we won't get anywhere. So Grégoire, Paolo, Odile, Jacob, thank you all. Thank you for being with us. And we continue on a different topic. Thank you very much.